Well, now that we've discussed strengths and limitations of the archaeological record, I'd like to turn our attention back again to hominin change over time, and especially within the genus Homo, which again, these are by the time that we are dealing with fully bipedal creatures that are quite human-like, we start calling them Homo. Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and so forth. Homo heidelbergensis, we continually are adding new species to this genus as we find more fossils. As we look at the genus Homo over time, we see some pretty interesting transitions happening. One of which is with the earliest species within this genus, we're starting to see really clearly that we've shifted from the types of diets that chimps and gorillas and other close ape relatives eat, so other apes that are closely genetically similar to humans, such as chimps and gorillas, and especially gorillas as an example, eat a lot of plants. I know gorillas look like brawny meat eaters, but they eat mostly plants with some insects, and chimps, it's kind of a similar story, although they do sometimes eat meat as well. By contrast, of course, human groups eat quite a bit of meat, and in early Homo we start to see that arise. We start to see that things like Homo habilis are eating a lot of plants. That's probably the majority of their calories, definitely, but also meat is definitely starting to become part of the diet, and we can tell that from a number of different things, including the types of tools that they were using and what they were most likely being used for, as well as changes in terms of people's bodies. Bipedalism was almost certainly an adaptation for, among other things, hunting, and for carrying of tools so that you could cut up meat and then bring it back. It is probably the case that these early hominins were hunting rather than scavenging, although there's some debate about that. Some anthropologists are of the opinion that the earliest human ancestors would have been scavengers that would have been sort of hacking up meat that they could take from, let's say, a kill that was done by a lion and then taking it back to home base. Probably they were hunting, though. I think that that's what the book is of the opinion, and I tend to agree with the authors on this point, among other things because we don't know of human groups generally, like modern hunting and gathering groups, which we obviously know a lot more about. Scavenging is not a big thing, and also, obviously, nowadays that would be very bad for your body, the way modern human bodies are. So it's hard to imagine that there was like a ton of scavenging going on back then. Although maybe, probably more likely, we're starting to get into large organized hunting at this point. And in that regard, humans are sort of, I call us the jerks of the hunter world, because probably the earliest hominins, the way they would hunt is probably the way that some modern hunter-gatherer groups hunt, although not nearly as advanced, in the sense that they would use what I'm going to call exhaustion-based hunting. And if you want a good description of exhaustion-based hunting, you should read the book Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. He's a popular writer, not an anthropologist as far as I know, but it's a pretty interesting book. He talks about the Taraharuma or Rarumari indigenous group from Mexico who are sort of notorious for being incredibly good runners. But as part of that, he talks sort of about how the earliest humans probably hunted, and this is backed up by some good archaeology and not just sort of random sports writer, but we've got some pretty good evidence that early humans were probably doing hunts as large groups that would then chase animals until the animals basically got overheated and they were weakened enough to the point where we could, bludgeon them with stone tools, or later, once we had invented spears, spear them. And that would have been a good adaptation for early humans and other early hominins because increasingly, as hominins kept evolving, they became very good long-distance runners. So some facts about humans, which are probably true to at least some degree of earlier hominins, is that we have good, basically, tendons and muscles for long-distance running. We're not going to win against a cheetah or even perhaps a brown bear, but we're good at long-distance running, and we're able to sweat profusely, which, as I mentioned last time, might not seem like a big blessing, but it is, and we're able to breathe in different ways than a lot of other animals when we're running, and we're bipedal. all of these things together mean that we can run very long distances, and what we probably did was we ran at animals long enough that they overheated and then speared them. So we're kind of jerks, but it was an effective strategy. By the way, I've got here a picture of the paleo diet, not in the paleo diet. So a few years ago, this may be before some of your times, but the paleo diet became very popular as kind of a diet that was allegedly based on what early humans were eating. And your book kind of critiques that, and I would critique that too. If we look at like this representation of the paleo diet, for example, olive oil, I can guarantee you that the earliest modern humans were not making olive oil. I can pretty much guarantee that. Nor were they using pumpkins, which are a domesticated plant, nor were in their modern form, nor would they have been eating domesticated chickens, right? So this is kind of preposterous. And I'm sure the authors of books about the paleo diet hopefully would recognize that. But this would not have been what earliest humans were eating. Some of these things definitely would have been. Probably one main difference between what you would eat on the paleo diet versus what early humans were using is it was probably just a much larger variety of foods. They had access to these sporadic different things growing at different times. So we have all these ideas of sort of what early humans were eating, some of which are accurate and some of which probably aren't accurate at all. But it is interesting to think about, partly because it has such a huge impact on our own bodies, right? Our own bodies, for the vast majority of hominin history, human bodies were adapted towards a hunter-gathering lifestyle. Now, there's been huge changes since then, and we can see those changes in our bodies. So we've talked before about the spread of lactose tolerance around the globe. So there's definitely been changes since farming got invented. But from an anthropological perspective, that was relatively recently, right? Only 10,000 years ago, compared to this sort of larger time period of hunter-gathering. So it makes sense, among other things, that humans have bodies that are sort of well adapted to a variety of different plant foods, and not just, feed us one kind of carb until we become super unhealthy. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what gender relations might have looked like in prehistoric groups. As your book talks about, this is one of those things that's highly speculative, right? It's pretty hard to look at a stone bi-faced hand axe and come away with a clear understanding of gender relations. But it's reasonable to assume, based on what we think about how they were hunting, as well as what other ape species do, that there was as well as what human species or human groups across the globe currently do, that early on we developed a gender division of labor. Generally speaking, hunter-gatherer groups in modern or recent history have a gender division of labor where men engage more so in the hunting, and particularly more so in the hunting of large animals, and women engage more so in the gathering of plant matter. That's not to say that men don't gather plant matter. It's not to say that women don't hunt. Certainly both are the case. And you also have, like groups where it's like the women don't hunt, but they will fish, for example. So it's not as easy as just sort of like hunt, meat versus plant matter. And by the way, I should point out that in many societies, the plant matter is actually the larger portion of the calories. But in any case, we see that kind of a division of labor in essentially all hunter-gatherer societies, something similar to that. And it's also reflected in some ape species, and it's reasonable to assume that that's how it was for early hominins, such as Homo erectus. So why would that have been the case, though? Why is it that men probably would have gone off on long hunts and then brought back meat to their families, to women and children? Why would that have been the case? There have been different theories proposed over time. Probably the earliest kind of theory, because it just sort of makes sense with how we think about, makes sense in the sense that it like fits with how people think about gender sometimes in the United States, is this idea of like, well, men have more upper body strength. That's sort of convincing and sort of not as a theory. The reason it's sort of not convincing is because although there's that statistical trend in upper body strength, and that makes sense if we're talking about like throwing a spear, yeah, that definitely makes sense on some level. But on the other hand, there are enough exceptions to that rule, enough women that would, like female Homo erectuses, that would have been able to throw a spear further than male ones, that's probably not a great theory on its own, if that's the only thing we're talking about. Plus, just think about this from an evolutionary standpoint. You want to use all your available labor, right? So if it was only about like, well, some people can throw a spear slightly further, 3 feet further than the other one, well, okay, fine, but the way humans were hunting, the way early hominins were hunting, it would have made sense to use all your labor, not to, have some of them stay home just because the spear was only going to go 1 foot less far. So given that humans aren't that crazy dimorphic compared to some species, by which I mean the differences between males and females are not as pronounced as many ape species, that's probably only a partial explanation, if an explanation at all. Probably more likely theory is that the gender division of labor has arisen in hunter-gatherer groups and probably has existed for millennia because it protects human infants. And so human infants have a prolonged lactation period. In a lot of sort of hunter-gatherer groups and other groups, this would have been, years rather than the sometimes, months that sometimes we see in the United States, or sometimes purely bottle feeding in the United States. In a lot of groups, this is something that goes on for years, and we have every reason to believe that early hominins were nursing infants for years of their lives until they were, strong enough and old enough. And that matters from an evolutionary standpoint, because you have to remember that from an evolutionary standpoint, the point isn't for things to survive for a long time. That's a means to an end. The point is to pass on genes. So you really want to make sure that your kids survive. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. One way is to produce a ton of children and hope that a few make it, which is the approach that like mosquitoes or mice take. And we sometimes call those R species. But then there's the approach that things like humans and elephants take, which is produce very few children, but invest heavily in them and try to make sure that each and every one does well. And so humans are the ultimate of that kind of species, and we call that a K species. Our infant period is really, really long, and it's during a really long time period. It takes a really long time period for humans to get up on their 2 feet and be able to fend for themselves. And during that time period, they need to be protected. And so it would make sense to keep them home from the hunt, especially given the fact that a lot of early humans were hunting things like mastodons, elephants, things that could straight up kill you, right? And certainly kill a small child if a small child was brought on the hunt. The child would slow you down, for one thing. The child would also probably could get harmed. That is not good business from an evolutionary standpoint. So it makes sense for children to be at home. But if children are going to be at home, they need to be nursed. And so it makes sense for the mothers to stay at home more often or to engage in gathering and small animal hunting, things that can be done closer to the home site so that you can strap the baby on your back and keep moving, but not have to be out there where a baby might get overheated or a baby might get hurt by a wild animal. So that's probably a big reason why there was an early gender division of labor. And beyond that, we can't say a ton about what was going on with gender in very early hominin species. It's another one of those things that we don't have a time machine to go interview people and say, hey, what's family life like for you? It is probably, maybe we can say one other thing, which is that it's very likely that stable pair bonding, what nowadays we conceptualize as marriage, would have arisen very early on within hominids. And we say that in part because that exists in some other ape species, and partly because it fits with what we understand about how hominin evolution was working, and the fact that probably you had men coming back with hunts from kills and then bringing that back to a family group. So probably pair bonding arose pretty early in the hominin record, although again, hard to interview people that have been gone for 2 million years. There's some other milestones that we could mention. So I've got here a firebender from the TV show Avatar. I've never really seen Avatar. I think I've seen one episode, so I'm just trying to be cool and hip because Avatar dropped on Netflix recently. But anyways, the reason I've got a firebender is because one of the most major milestones that occurred in this time period was fire. Now we're cooking. No, literally, now we're cooking. When fire was invented, the ability to start fires intentionally, I should say, and use them, this was a huge, huge, huge leap forward for hominins. It allowed new types of tools to be created. It eventually allowed for metal, because you could smelt ore using fire. Things like early metals that you could turn into different kinds of weapons now. It allowed for a social center, right? It's pretty clear that early groups probably gathered around the hearth, whether to eat or to tell stories and to tell music. They, do what modern humans do as far as use the campfire as kind of a place to hang out. it would have been a form of protection. That lots and lots of animals fear fire if they see it, so it would have been a form of protection from other animals for a species that, to be blunt, is not the strongest species on the block. We're not the weakest, we're not going to be taken out by a rabbit, but we could be taken out pretty easily by a lion. And so fire allows us a certain amount of protection to have a fire going in our settlements. It also allows cooking. Cooking is huge. Obviously nowadays, most types of meat humans cannot safely consume raw, and so cooking is absolutely essential now, but we've got pretty good reasons to think that it's been essential for a very long time, and that the fact that it's essential now is a byproduct of our evolutionary history, that cooking arose very early on. How early on is unclear. We have definitely really, really clear, obvious sites where you have clear, like, hearths, places where people were cooking, and where it left, like charcoal, basically. They go back, according to radiocarbon dating, about 0.5 million years ago. You have other sites that may or may not have been uses of fire, going all the way back to about 3 million years ago, so before even genus Homo. It's unclear, a lot of those, whether or not they were intentional uses of fire, partly because fire is just a naturally occurring thing, right? Any given summer in Alaska, you have forest fires going on all over the state. They're often small, sometimes they're big, but they're often small, and that's true of many places around the world. So you have a lot of just natural fire, lightning-based fire, so it's hard to tell with a lot of early sites when exactly fire arose, and that's an ongoing conversation and debate in anthropology. But certainly for hundreds of thousands of years, hominins have been using fire, and probably one of the reasons that probably there's ambiguity is that it probably wasn't all at once. It's probably not like one day, some Homo habilis was just like, hey, what up? I invented fire. Probably what more likely happened is that, at least the theory goes, is that early hominins started to use fire that was naturally produced by lightning and other forces. So you'd have natural fires like forest fires, and then they would start to use this, such as collecting, burning coals basically from the burned up trees and then transporting these around, or so to speak, like carrying it away, like on a burning wood and then making their own fire from it. And then over time, humans developed the ability to essentially rub sticks together around kindling and start a fire. And so, but that would have taken hundreds of thousands of years for that technology to get to that point. But fire was a major watershed moment. There were other major moments that without which we would look very, very different. 400,000 years ago, we have our first clear evidence of spears, projectiles, which really changes the game. Whether, again, it's possible that early hominins were throwing the hand axes, but if they weren't, this is the first time that you really have humans suddenly become long distance. We suddenly become glass cannons, if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons terminology, where we're able to kind of stand back from a distance, and even though we're maybe not the strongest thing in the world compared to an elephant, hit an elephant from a distance, hit a giraffe from a distance. 30,000 years ago, we have clear evidence of what are called atlatls, which are these, like, basically, as you can see in this drawing here, like you do this overhead swing thing and like throw a projectile. 65,000 years ago, we start to see our first really, really clear, obvious evidence of art in things like Neanderthal cave paintings in places like Spain. So that's one of our earliest sites, is these Neanderthal, or at least they appear to be Neanderthal. It's possible given the time period that they were earlier Homo sapien, but art. And by the way, that's a little bit arbitrary anyway, since some would argue that Neanderthals should be considered a part of Homo sapiens. 43,000 years ago, music? Maybe? Probably not? It's unclear. You have this flute that's sometimes called the Neanderthal flute, and it's unclear if it's an intentional flute or if it's just a bone that was punctured by animal teeth. And I bring that up partly to show that music's been with us for a very long time, probably. Whether this is the earliest example of music or not, we have every reason to believe that music has existed for thousands and thousands of years. But also to suggest that the fact that we don't have clear artifacts like that earlier suggests that music comes along pretty late in the hominin game, right? This is a pretty recent invention. So I want you to think about that, because in many ways, for many of us humans, so much of what we are as humans is defined by our music. We use music to bond ourselves as communities. We use music to dance. We use music to develop romances. We use music to mourn. We use music to worship. So music is a huge, powerful, fundamental part of human life, found in all human societies, and yet it's a pretty recent invention, potentially more recent even than modern Homo sapiens. It's very possible that Homo sapiens, at least I should say, even if they were singing, we're not using actual tools for a while, or sorry, actual instruments. So that's interesting. It's also the Neanderthal flute story is also an interesting example of why archaeology is hard. Because again, is this a flute? Is this something that an animal bit into and just kind of looks like a flute? Tough to say. I think it looks like a flute. Oh well. And I've kind of just put in here, that shouldn't say that should say game. But notice the things that evolved late in the game. Things like art. Things like music, things like weapons, true projectile weapons, are relatively recent. So the human life that we live today is so different from what early hominins were living. Now, I said at the start of this lecture, I characterized it as the world before farming. And you might have said, the world before farming, what? Well, you might ask yourself, why did we cut it off at about 20,000 years ago? The reason is because after 20,000 years ago, a bunch of major, huge things happened in human history. Probably the majorest of which, not a word, majorist, anyways, probably the majorist of which was the Neolithic Revolution. Starting around 10,000 years ago, maybe a little older, humans start domesticating things. We start hijacking evolution to make crops, to make domesticated animals, and that changes everything. So I've got here, you sometimes see these bumper stickers, farmers feed the world, and I've modified it to say farmers transformed the prehistoric world because it changes so much. You have this bumper sticker where it's like evolution of man, should just say evolution of humans anyways, and you've got the farmer as the ultimate form of evolution. And this is obviously, these types of bumper stickers are there to say how important farmers are, and I agree, farmers are incredibly important, but I'm sort of using them to make the point that not only are farmers incredibly important in the modern world, but that they transformed the prehistoric world in the sense that when farming first developed, it took these mobile small bands of hunting-gathering humans and transformed societies into large groups of thousands and later millions of people with cities, with writing systems, with extremely sophisticated weapon systems and navigation systems. All sorts of things start changing once farming enters the game. So even though hominins, in this case humans, have not been farming very long at all, from a historic standpoint, really just a few thousand years, that changed everything. And the world we live in today is by and large because some humans about 10,000 years ago started figuring out, hey, we can make these seeds a little bigger. We can make these plants grow where we want them to. Okay, well, we'll talk more about that next time. Thank you so much for your attention.